Home Secretary Amber Rudd says the possibility of no deal being reached with the EU over Brexit is unthinkable. The warning comes as a study by the Resolution Foundation claims that a no-deal situation would leave more than 3 million families more than £500 a year worse off. So, can Britain afford Brexit? Joined from central London by Stephen Clarke from the Resolution Foundation, who helped write that report, and by Patrick Minford, who is an economist at Cardiff University and was a prominent member of the Economists for Brexit campaign group. So, as you can imagine, they're not likely to agree. Most certainly, let's find out, should we? Stephen, to you first of all, you're co-author of this report that says that if there's no deal, it's going to cost 3 million households something like £500 a year each. Why do you think that's the case?
So what we've done, we know the government is committed to getting a comprehensive free trade deal with the European Union, but what we've looked at is what happens if that doesn't happen. If we do leave the European Union, the government has said that it will raise tariffs to the level prescribed by the WTO, and therefore tariffs will be raised on goods coming from the EU to the UK. So we've looked at what the effect of those tariff rises will be on the prices of the goods that households consume, and because tariffs will go up, and therefore the price of things like meat and dairy products and cars will go up, the average household will have to pay more, and we've estimated that will cost around £260 for the average household, but some households could experience price rises of above £500 a year. Those are the 3 million that you're talking about.
So there, Professor, what do you have to say about that?
Well, the thing is, Kay, that what they leave out is all the free trade agreements with the rest of the world, and indeed the rest of the world, full stop, which come in, of course, at those tariffs at the moment into the EU, the items he mentioned. So what these EU producers would do, even if we had no free trade agreements with the rest of the world, is they would raise their prices, as Stephen says, maybe, but then they'd find they would be undercut by the food coming in from the rest of the world. And so poor consumers in particular, of course, would switch massively away from much more expensive EU food to these alternative sources from the rest of the world. But it's worse than that, because what the Resolution Foundation have left out is the government's policy is to do free trade agreements with all these other countries, which would get rid of those tariffs on the food from these other countries. And so they would come in, on average, about 20% cheaper. So what the Foundation have done is got it completely the wrong way round.
Oh. So there you go, Stephen. You've not taken into account trade with places like Australasia and continental United States.
Well, we have done. What we've done is, and we're basing this on what the government said it's going to do. It said that should we leave without a deal, it will have to revert to WTO rules, because they're the rules that the WTO prescribe, and we are a member of the WTO, or we will be if we leave, and therefore we'll have to abide by them. And we have looked at trade with other countries, but it's worth bearing in mind that the lion's share of our trade, about 50% of imports, come from the EU. The amount of trade we do with places like Australia is minuscule in comparison, and although over time that may change. I mean, Australia's a small place, probably not a lot, but we could do more trade with places like China, India and America. Hammering out free trade deals with those places will be very difficult, and as the recent experiences with the EU have shown, that it can take many, many years for trade deals to be negotiated and agreed.
So, Professor, you're looking towards a utopia, and there could be these deals, but it's going to take a long time, is what Stephen's saying.
No. It's not a utopia. What Stephen and the Resolution Foundation have left out is what we call substitution. If the EU producers raise their prices by the amounts that Stephen's talking about, even if we do no free trade deals, there'll be massive substitution towards these other sources, because the reason they don't sell us anything is because at the moment EU prices, of course, keep them out, because the barriers of trade that the EU have put in place raise their prices so that they match the EU prices currently being charged to us by the EU to our consumers. But of course, if we put tariffs on the EU producers, they won't be able to raise their prices to this extent, or even to any extent. Certainly not that poor consumers will buy, because they will be completely outpriced by food coming in from these other sources that hitherto, have been unable to compete because EU prices have been matching them. And then the second point is, yes, FTAs take a little bit of time to negotiate. The Australian Prime Minister said about a year in his case, And since we've got this transition agreement and certainly got a year and a quarter until March 2019, even if we don't have a transition agreement, we've got ample time to negotiate free trade agreements with Australia that said it's extremely keen, the US that's extremely keen, New Zealand that's extremely keen, all of which are massive producers of extremely much cheaper food than we get from the EU. So this report by the Resolution Foundation is simply another of these sort of Ramona, reports to kind of frighten us off Brexit. The whole thing is inconsistent with the free trade policy being pursued by the government.
Stephen Clark?
Well, I mean, the government's policy at the moment is to revert to WTO tariffs, which is what we've looked at. We haven't looked at perhaps what might happen in the long run in the future. But it is fair to say that the majority of deep trade deals with places like America do take some time, and we don't import a lot from Australia for lots of reasons. By and large, distance is one. Australia doesn't necessarily produce all the things we need, and we do import a lot from the EU. So what this report does is just say, if we leave without a deal, tariffs will rise. That's the government's policy, and we've just looked at what the impact will be on household spending. Now, there might be lots of long-run effects, and the future is very difficult to predict, but we've just focused on what we know will happen, should we leave without a deal in 2019, and tariffs will rise, and that is currently government policy as it stands.
Professor, I suppose, for people listening at home, they hear one side giving one set of figures, they hear the other side giving the other set of figures, and probably the truth lies somewhere in the middle. The bottom line is, are people going to be any better off after Brexit? What do you think?
They're going to be massively better off, because what we will do is we will sign free trade agreements. I mean, Stephen's right. In the short run, we go to putting on these tariffs, because that's the short-run thing you do when you replace the EU as your WTO, when you become a full member. Well, we are a full member, but we speak for ourselves, and we will, in the first place, he's right, put on those tariffs. But they won't come into force until we've left the EU, by which time we'll have done all these free trade deals. I don't know why he thinks that's long run. I mean, that's the key point of our government policy. And if we do these free trade deals, the thing that all your people at home have got to remember is that will allow in food from America, Australia and New Zealand, which got displaced when we joined the EU and put on all this protectionist common agricultural policy tariff stuff, which is what Stephen's talking about. But that will be completely reversed, and that's the whole idea of Brexit. And it'll bring down the cost of food by 20% when that is done. And it will be done as soon as we're out of the EU, because we will have negotiated these free trade agreements by then.
Stephen, we're going to be massively better off when we leave the EU.
So we do look at more than just food, which is what Patrick's talking about. So we do look at the prices of things like cars and other items. It's not just food that we look at. And so what we've done is, like he accepts, we've looked at what will happen in terms of the tariff rises. That's all we know at the moment. The idea that we're going to sign lots of free trade deals very quickly, no one knows whether that's true or not. What we focused on, what we do know is going to happen, which, as Patrick accepts, is that tariffs will rise under WTO rules. And if that happens, households will be, as I said, around £260 off on average, and poorer households will be hit more harsher than richer households. So that's what we've done. In the long run, we don't know exactly what the effects will be, and this report doesn't deal with those long-run effects. OK. We started with you, Stephen, so we must end with the Professor, for reasons of balance, of course. Professor, I was listening to the would-be Madam President, who lost out to President Trump, of course, and she says, don't believe a word he says when it comes to trade deals. Why should we?
Well, it's not just President Trump. It's Australia, New Zealand and other food producers around the world. And I appreciate that Stephen's using government policy. Government policy is to go to free trade and sign these free trade deals. So if you're looking at government policy, that's what you've got to assume. That's what Brexit is all about. Of course, if we go to protectionist policies, as he's effectively assumed, you won't get the full benefits of Brexit. Everyone has always said that. Certainly I have always said that. The whole idea of Brexit is to get away from EU protectionism, to get those free trade agreements with the rest of the world and let all those products, food and manufacturers in at world prices. And that actually will bring down prices even more than I said, because I was just talking about food. It'll bring them down 8% on the consumer price index. And so that's a big gain if we carry out what government policy is.
OK, good to talk to both of you. Thank you very much indeed.